Good morning. I am so excited to be here again today. My name is Samantha Madeline Cook. I'm the author of History Compass, and this is the second in a series of workshops that we're going to be doing together. The first one was more of a Q&A, and if you haven't watched that, there were a lot of really great questions asked in that session, so I really encourage you to go back and watch that one. And if there's any lingering questions, by all means, feel free to tag me in a post. And then this one, we're going to be talking about primary sources. The next two are really interesting. Also, we're going to be doing one on object studies and one on maps, and those are a little bit more hands-on, and I'll talk about them at the end of this session today. You'll have to excuse me, I'm still in transition. As some of you know, I'm moving from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific Northwest, and we're still in rentals, trying to figure out where we're going to live. So I appreciate your patience while I work towards getting my workshop back. Okay, so today we're talking about primary sources, and primary sources play a significant role in History Compass and in the study of history. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that today. I wanted to talk about what they are, how they relate to other kinds of sources, what are those, how do they contribute to the historical narrative, how we use them in history education, I thought would be a good topic, um, and also how they connect to historical literacy, because I've talked a lot about historical literacy being an absolutely necessary skill for students to have, for all of us to have, really, to participate in not just our whatever country you're in, your culture, but our culture, but also as a global citizen, right? And in understanding and connecting to other countries and cultures around the world. And so primary sources do play, I think, a really important role in historical literacy. So we are going to kind of start there, and I'm going to go through, but if you have questions or comments along the way, please feel free to write them in the comment section. And um, I have help in case I don't always see the comments for some reason. I'm working on it. And but if I don't see it, I have help that will see it and will let me know. So, okay, so first let's talk about what is a primary source. Well, what are sources? What are sources in general? I would say that the simplest definition of sources are information and documentation, right? They're places in which we get information, or it's a documentation of some sort of information, a person, place, event, you know. Now, there are three main types of sources, and I talk about them in, I think, lesson 10 of History Compass. So we have primary, secondary, and tertiary sources. And I wanted to just briefly go over this because it's important to the context of primary sources. The first is primary sources, of course, and they are created during a very specific event or time period. Um, and secondary sources examine, explains, or analyzes mostly primary sources, right? It seeks to take that information, analyze it or compare it, make sense of it, I think is a good way of putting it. And then we have tertiary sources. Now, these are not original research at all. They're usually some sort of synthesis or summary or documentation of secondary sources, mostly secondary sources. Occasionally you'll find a tertiary source that puts primary sources in order, but it's mostly secondary sources that, and those are things like encyclopedias, for example. Um, so they are actually really great sources to use, especially to get started in research. But as I say in the book, they aren't really something that would be used for citation. They're just used to get you started and to move you forward. So those are the three main types. And then we're going to focus in now on primary sources. Primary sources are, again, these, whatever, it's created during the time period, during the event. So they are things like artifacts and diaries and journals. I mean, they could be anything really. And what's cool is that a lot of primary sources can be used sometimes as secondary sources. Um, but primary sources tell us so much about an event, a person, a place, and they are what I would consider um, things like uh, evidence, right? So let's talk about that. That they contribute to the historical narrative. Now, when I say historical narrative, what I mean is the way history has been told. Um, Historiography, which is the methods by which history has been written, has changed over time. But this historical narrative has been sort of built on each other, right, over time. And so a lot of the evidence that we have, or a lot of the ways in which it's written, are based on the evidence that we have. It's the interpretation of these primary sources that really changes the way history has been told. So, how do they contribute to the historical narrative? Well, they provide evidence, right? We have primary sources that tell us a lot about, especially, I want to point out that for some time periods, places, cultures, primary sources are the evidence that we have. We do not have any written records necessarily. And so it is the only way that we are able to at least attempt to provide a foundation of the voices of that culture. So they provide evidence, they provide perspective, right? When we look at an oral history or a journal from somebody um, from a particular time period, we have um, their perspective on what happened. And I do want to point out that primary sources can be and often are biased, right? They're if especially if it's a written kind of documentation, you have a very specific point of view, a very specific experience, and so we vet them the same way that we do all sources. We look at the context under which they were made. The way in which they were written, who they were written by, under what duress they were written, right? There's all sorts of ways, and I'm going to get into that in a minute. They also provide diversity in our historical narrative. So we look at different kinds of primary sources, everything from objects to written material, to see the diversity of perspectives and the um, experiences of all different sorts of people who were alive right during this time period or during this event and what they experienced. um, and then, like I said, interpretation. So when historians look at primary sources, they are trying to figure out a couple of things. The first is, what does it mean to the larger event or time period? They're trying to figure out how it was made, why it was made, um, how does it tell us more? There's all sorts of questions we can ask of primary sources. But I do want to point out that the way in which historians interpret primary sources can really influence the way history has been told. And I'm going to give you an example of this. It's actually a really simple example, but I think it's really important and effective. So if we look at many of you will be familiar with the Woman of Willendorf. It's a small statue. Um, it's a prehistoric statue. It's of a woman. It's about 4 inches high, and it's about 25,000 years old. And the form of this figure is very voluptuous and beautifully created. And for a long time, it was called the Venus of Willendorf. Willendorf is the location in which it was found. And historians, because of that, it was given that name at a very particular time. They started to see it as kind of a goddess figure, right? And they started to idealize this prehistoric figure in a way that was their interpretation, but not necessarily um, what it meant, right? We don't have any documentation of what these female figurines, many of which have been found, actually mean to prehistoric culture, right? We have no evidence that she was worshipped, right? That she was a symbol of worship or as a sort of fertility goddess. So when historians applied that interpretation to it, it changed the way she was talked about for many, many years. And it's only now that historians are really backing away from calling her that and entitling it Woman of Willendorf instead, to kind of remove these layers of assumptions, right, on this figure. And I think that's just one example of many, many, many examples of how a primary source can be interpreted in a way that really affects the historical narrative. Um, so then the question is, well, how does this connect to historical literacy? Now, historical literacy, again, is having the knowledge and skills to think, research, and write about history. And I talked a lot about why this is important in the last video, so I won't go too far into it. But I do want to point out that when students have an opportunity to see primary sources as a part of their history education, right, as part of their literacy, they start thinking for themselves critically. When primary sources are a part of the work that they're doing, they start to take on interpretations, evaluations, perspectives of their own. And this is a really important skill. We live in a world where there is a lot of interpretation and bias and false information. And so to be able to go back to the source, right, of our documentation, of our knowledge, and look at it really critically and say, does this interpretation make sense to me? Do I get the same things out of it? What do I see? What do I feel? I think that's a wonderful skill to have, but it also builds a kind of learner that is different than somebody who just takes in information. Um, I think this is a good time to point out again, this is why I wrote History Compass first. I actually stopped writing ancient history in order to finish this one because I really wanted students to have these skills and sort of lay the foundation, right? Front load all of these skills ahead of time so that when they are confronted with research assignments or information that is fluid, right? The historical narrative is an evolving, changing body of work. We are constantly, as historians, archaeologists, uh, all of the people involved in writing the historical narrative or continuing the historical narrative um, are looking at all of these things, and historiography, the way, the methods by which it's written are constantly changing and being modernized and being expanded. And so if students can look at this as an evolving body of work that they can contribute to, I think that's really important. Um, I think that they need to understand and be able to work with this evidence. And then I also want to point out that it's really important for inclusion and intersectionality. When primary sources are used, we are able to see, well, what's missing, right? Much easier than when we're only looking at secondary sources and people's interpretation of what was important. Well, if we look at what we have, the evidence that we have, we can much more easily say, oh, well, what is missing? Why is it missing? Um, is it missing because we just don't have it, or is it being suppressed by the historical narrative? And then the intersectionality, we can see in primary sources how these pieces of evidence kind of layer and intersect, how a journal, for example, from the Civil War, from different kinds of people, right? Different from enslaved people to soldiers to nurses, right? How each one of them has a life that is based on what they are experiencing in that event. Again, building up a much more truthful kind of narrative. So then how is it that we integrate primary sources into the historical narrative? There's a couple of ways in which I think it's important to do it, and I'm going to kind of talk a little bit more about this, but I just want to briefly kind of summarize. There's the research itself, and this can be for projects or this can be for essays. um, object studies, doing some sort of analysis, modeling or mimicking, looking at how a primary source was possibly made. For example, if we're looking at some sort of tool, for example, or I'm trying to think of a some sort of like a shadoof. Yeah, I don't know why that was the first thing that came up to my mind, but in Egypt, the shadoofs were used to ancient Egypt. They were used to transport water, and they're actually still used today around the world. Um, when we look at that as a innovation, right, that we can look at the mechanics of it, but it can also really inspire kids to go down kind of a different path and maybe join that up with other research that they're doing perhaps in their science studies. I do want to talk about cross-pollination and object-based learning in a minute. But I want to get to the primary sources themselves. I want to talk about this a little bit before I get there. Um, so let's talk about if you happen to have History Compass with you. I showed this in the last workshop. This amazing hard copy book that I have of History Compass, and it allows me to share it with you in a different way. But I want you to notice in lesson 10 these primary sources that we look at. So if we just look at these for a second, it takes you through how to work with these primary sources. But I just wanted to talk about them a little bit because I think I've actually worked with these several times and I've taught with these primary sources several times. And I just love how they work together, but they also provide really great examples of how we can work with them. So the first source is actually an inspection card. And when I approach my students with this particular primary source, oftentimes they start off by saying, "Oh, it's a piece of paper," and I'm like, "Yeah. So what does it do?" Well, it inspects their stuff. Well, okay, but let's look closer at it. And so we start diving into a real close look at this primary source. And it didn't occur to many of my students that when immigrants were coming into Ellis Island, that it wasn't just their stuff that was being inspected, it was the people themselves. And so we can figure out where they came from, when they came, often the ship they came on. There's a whole bunch of information that we can actually find just by looking at the inspection card. Things, though, that often my students start to wonder when they are examining this, though, is what it doesn't tell us, right? It doesn't tell us why they decided to immigrate. It doesn't tell us. It tells us that they passed the inspection or did not, depending on the inspection card. But it doesn't tell us how that might have felt, right? We would have to actually add other sources, perhaps some oral histories around what that experience was like. It doesn't talk about what was going on, where they came from, or what their experience was once they got there. There was a lot of information missing, but this one thing is useful, especially when we're trying to find ports that were really popular, um, perhaps the rate at which inspections were done and the results of those inspections. Um, the second source is this illustration, and I'm going to try to hold it up there. That illustration, I think, is really, really wonderful, especially when paired with the other primary source that I'm going to show you next, which is the photograph. This one here. So those two are really visual primary sources, right? We're looking at them, and I find that they're usually the favorites of this particular lesson. Um, but I always start out with, what do you see? What do you see? Because these two are both immigrants on a boat going to Ellis Island, right? They have so much in common, and yet the difference between them is really interesting and quite stark, actually. This illustration is very optimistic. It's uh, many of my students decided it absolutely was propaganda. Um, and it depicts a vision of immigration that's very specific. Now, the question is why, right? This is how we start with primary sources. Why the context? Why on earth would um, this illustration be important to the narrative being built around Ellis Island, especially at this time? Whereas the photograph is a visual of what life was like on board without. Now, could photographs also be staged in a way that was propaganda? Absolutely. But was this one, right? And so as we work through these sources, we're building up a real understanding of what this process was like. Now, source 4 is the passenger records, and 5 is oral history. So now we're starting to join and layer, right, these primary sources in a way that builds a picture that's very different from just reading about it in a history book, right? These are real people. I actually have a section in this book that tells about, my own family's experience and um, what it was a little bit about what it was like, and that is, an important part of understanding that this wasn't just an event that happened. These were people that happened to, and it affects people. The way in which people move through the past is the way in which it affects the future, right? It affects us still today. Um, the last one is the collection online, which is the objects, right? So we're looking at actual objects that came through that were preserved in some way. And this is where I think it ties it all together. So we have information, right? Some sort of documentation with the inspection card and the passenger records. We have oral history. We have visuals, right? Photographs, illustrations, and now we have objects. All of them together can build this beautiful story. And then I often have students compare it to what they're finding in history books. So I will give them narratives to read um, that are secondary sources, right? So these are books written by experts about this experience. And I want them to start looking at how these primary sources relate to how this history is being written. What is missing? What is not? Was it the same way they would tell this story? What more do they want to know? These it provokes a curiosity that is usually not found when students are only reading history books, especially like secondary sources. And so in the history books, textbooks I'm writing now, for example, primary sources are they play a central role because I want them to dig deeper. I want them to have a relationship with these pieces of history instead of just reading other interpretations of it. I want them to create their own interpretation of it. I'm going to stop here and see, is there any questions? Somehow I can actually see the comments this time. I'm really excited. Not yet. Okay. Just a reminder, you can put a comment in and it'll pop up for me, and then I can go deeper into whatever your question is. I'm particularly interested in knowing what you're studying now so that perhaps we can brainstorm around what primary sources might be interesting to dig into for your study right now. So another example that I give in lesson 10 is the idea of if you were doing a research assignment, maybe an essay on how the company Atari shaped and influenced video game history. As you can imagine, I've come across a lot of students where video games are a very interesting topic to them, and that's awesome. I think that's great. And so I really try to make sure that there is some choice and some interest-based assignments for when I am teaching. And so I mentioned like the primary sources you could use include the actual Atari game consoles, photographs of people playing Atari at home, advertisements, newspaper reviews, or brochures from the Atari Clubhouse. And I just want to point out, like, this is really, um, it's a really wonderful way of looking at it because some of these, maybe you wouldn't have even thought of, like the Atari game console itself. There's this deep dive you can do. I would actually do an object study with that. The next workshop that I'm doing in August, we're actually going to do an object study together. And there's a list of supplies if you want to join in. We're actually going to do an object study and we're going to analyze it together. And the game console is really interesting because it was designed in a very specific way. It was designed aesthetically, not just for the time period that it was created in, but for its purpose itself. Um, when I looked at photographs of people playing Atari at home or in tournaments, I was noticing a theme that was reoccurring. Um, almost all the photographs that I found were of white males playing Atari. And I thought to myself, that's interesting because I played Atari and my cousins played Atari, and this does not ring true for me in my own experience. So what is the actual truth of this primary source that I'm finding over and over and over again? And I had to dig real deep to find more photographs of girls and women playing, of people of color playing. Like I just it was fascinating to me, and yet um, as I dug deeper, there are reasons why that is true. I don't need to dig into that at the moment, but um, my students and I really dove deep into that, and then looked at why that is true, if it is, was it just the documentation that happened, and why would it only be documented that way? And then comparing it to video games now and advertisements now, and how that has changed over time. Um, Advertisements for Atari, there's a really great one that talks about Atari being just the ultimate um, device of the future. And it does a great job of selling Atari in a very gender neutral way, and it shows a lot of diversity, and the way that it's written is very persuasive. So of course it's biased, it's propaganda, but it really shows the way in which video games were being inserted into culture. And then of course the Atari Clubhouse and like membership groups. So again, it's these things painting a picture altogether. Then I think about other examples like the Indus Valley, right, which the written language of which has not really been rediscovered and deciphered yet. And so all we can go on is the buildings, the streets, the towns, the artifacts that we find, and we build this narrative. One of which, a great example of this, is that we don't find really any, we don't find a whole lot of weapons or any evidence of war culture in this community, or these communities. Indus Valley was spread over a large territory. So there was this historical narrative around it being a very peaceful civilization. Now, that could absolutely be true, but we have no documentation or written documents to prove that. So it's an ongoing query. It's a mystery that we have yet to solve, and that's, I think, one of the awesome things about history is just it's never done. It's never done. Um, Oh, I see. I was late, so you may have overcovered. Are folk tales within a collection of folk tales from ancient Scylla considered primary sources? So this is tricky, right? I think that's a fantastic question. Folk tales are really tricky because most folk tales are oral history, right? That have evolved over time. And um, so they were told, right, from person to person, usually many, many, many years, sometimes centuries before they were actually written down. And then it depends on who wrote them down, right? For example, um, all of the I would say most, almost, I would say maybe even all of the Celtic folk tales, for example, were written down by Christian monks. Um, the old Nordic tales, a lot of the African folk tales that I've read were written down centuries after they were really devised and written. Even the Epic of Gilgamesh wasn't written down right away. So we have this evolution of folk tales that happens, but at some point, right, you have to be able to use them. So what I do with folk tales is I go ahead and find the best source that I can. I often try to find somebody who has researched and written the folk tales, who is a member of that culture or a descendant of that culture. Um, if I can, it's not always possible, but if I can. And then I analyze it for bias. So in the book, I use CAP, which is a great simple way of doing it, and that's context, audience, purpose, and point of view, right? And so primary sources should be analyzed. That's actually a great segue. They should be analyzed just like any other source should be analyzed. So folk tales are terrific because yes, they are in a sense primary sources for sure. Um, and but you also again just have to be careful about their interpretation. Who are they being um, rewritten by? I think it's really important, especially some of them were researched and written in the late 19th and early 20th centuries by I think most of the history books call them explorers. I would definitely not use that word, but there were a lot of European, significantly British um, people going into places like, you know, Egypt, the Middle East, Africa, and doing research, right, and writing these things down. But their interpretation of these folk tales is unlikely to be super accurate to the oral history tradition of those cultures. So we've just got to be really careful about folk tales and acknowledge that. I don't think there's any reason not to use those. I just think we got to be really careful about acknowledging it, especially in our work, right? That in itself, researching how they were discovered, how they were rewritten, why they were rewritten, or why they were written by this particular person, that's an interesting part of the research in itself, and again contributes to that more truthful narrative. And then we do have some primary sources, right? That, for example, the Epic of Gilgamesh, we do have these tablets, right, that we are directly translating um, from. Now, even within that, so a couple of years ago, they discovered a new tablet for the Epic of Gilgamesh that really gets into the um, ecology of the cedar forest. It's so beautiful. Honestly, go look it up. It's just beautiful. And it kind of changed the dynamic of that particular scene when Gilgamesh goes into the forest and to confront Humbaba and you know, his destruction of that. And so that new tablet added a new perspective to this entire story, but then also the way in which these tablets are being deciphered and interpreted is changing and evolving. Like just the change of a word actually can change the meaning of an entire scene. And so again, that's another really interesting area of like folk tales and history written in history that you can look at when you are looking at these primary sources. That how is the understanding of what this means changed over time. Egyptian hieroglyphs are another really great example of how the interpretation of certain words, the way in which the flow of that language it's evolving in the way that we understand it. It's very, very cool. But that was a great question. Thank you for asking that because folktales can be a little trickier. Um, so when we are analyzing and vetting primary sources, actually, I have a great example of this that I wanted to bring up. On page 136, I give an example of a historic map of Colorado, and I have it here. I'm just gonna kind of pop it up here. Whoops. So I know it's hard to see here, but this historical map was published in 1935, and it was absolutely propaganda. Um, oh, thank you, Maggie. I'm really happy to be doing it, and I hope you watch the playback and join us next time. So it was created to highlight the history of the state and show the route of 20 explorers. Again, that word is in here. It is not my word. Um, and I actually go over on this page. This is when you're researching your topic, I provide this really great chart. Um, and it's what I'm asking the students to do in this is analyze their sources using this chart just to make it a little easier, right? So we have the source, which is the map, the type, which is a map, the currency, it was made in 1935, it's a primary source, and the context, right? So again, we're going to analyze these primary sources. So in this case, the context is that it was prepared by the State Historical Society of Colorado, which was founded in 1879. That is a very specific time in American history. And it was made during 1935, which was kind of during the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl, the New Deal, and the Indian Recognition Act. There were tensions building in Europe that would result in World War II. Like, there's a lot going on. And so the context actually gives us a really great understanding of why this map might have been made. It was definitely for public education. I would argue it's also propaganda. And the purpose is to highlight the history of Colorado with portraits of what they consider distinguished leaders, historical events, battles, frontier forts, right? They're basically like glamorizing and idealizing the state's history, particularly in the pioneer trails and westward expansion. It has a very romantic quality of like pride and heritage. The artist himself, so that was the purpose. The point of view, the artist was commissioned. He also worked at the Museum of Natural History in Denver, and his work, if you look at C.W. Love's work, it's all very illustrative, artistic, very romantic, and it values the ideas of this westward expansion and colonization. Honestly, there is no diversity in the perspective of this map at all. But as a primary source, it does tell us quite a lot about what was going on in Colorado at this time. There is a credibility to the point of view of this map, right? It is a very specific perspective of the 1930s. The locations are accurate, but it is not a credible source for other perspectives. For example, there is very high bias and inaccuracies. They call the Meeker incident a massacre, while Sand Creek a battle, which it was not. It was a massacre. And I would argue the Meeker incident was not either. Was not a massacre either, I should say. Sand Creek was, but the Meeker incident was different than that. And so I think that using something like this, right, where you're like, well, how do I use a map like this? Well, it's telling us a lot about that period of history from a very specific perspective, right? It tells us a lot about how generally white people, particularly white men in Colorado, were viewing their state, the propaganda that they were coming up with in order to create a sense of heritage. They're probably instilling a sense of patriotism, even nationalism, I would argue, um, in order to meet very specific goals. And that's interesting on its own, right? Because that tells us something about that uh, perspective in history. But it also tells us a lot about what other people were experiencing in the state of Colorado in 1935, right? And we can start to analyze, well, if this was happening, if this was the perspective, if these were the values being promoted, then what was happening to everybody else? And I think that oftentimes we can look at what's missing or what's being promoted and then start to look at inclusion, right? And bringing in diverse voices. And I wanted to point this out and use this map to do it because I very specifically think that primary sources can be used for that exact purpose to bring in other perspectives and to start filling in the parts of history that haven't necessarily been written or researched, especially not as much. So that's one example. There's lots of examples in the book that I could pull out in terms of um, using I was just flipping to the map section here. Since we're on the theme of maps, um, I am fascinated. If you look at 101, I am fascinated with these two maps. So in those two maps, what I talk about is the one on the left is Tolkien's original map of Middle Earth, and the second one is John Ogilvy's map. It's of London to Bristol, and this style of them is certainly very similar, but this is a great way in which I can see primary sources actually starting to cross-pollinate. So now I'm going to get into a little bit about how I use primary sources, both inside and outside of history education. So the first idea is this idea of cross-pollination. So primary sources certainly play a role in history education, but they can also play a role in cross-pollinating other areas that you're studying. For example, and by cross-pollination, I mean that uh, you can take what you're already studying and find the places where there's overlap. And oftentimes, primary sources can be the bridge that lets you do it. So, for example, that the map that I just showed you, certainly you can be studying American history and you can look at propaganda maps and you can kind of study what was going on and what the sense of like um, nationalism and heritage, and then like what everybody else was experiencing because of it. But then the map is actually topographical, and you can really translate that then into things like geology. The way in which the Rocky Mountains were formed is a very interesting story. And if you have a student who's really interested in geology, plate tectonics, I can think of several subjects in the area of science that you could go. It can be a bridge to then start looking at how that was depicted and what we know about that science, right? And more modern maps. So there's a study there bridging to science that you can absolutely do. The Shadoof that I mentioned earlier is another great example of physics, right? And using mechanical devices, even if they're manual, to move water. But these are as much science topics as they are history topics, and so it can be this wonderful bridge. And oftentimes it's the primary source; it's the object that gets us to that thing. These maps that I just mentioned are a great example of literature, right? In studying English uh, or language arts as a whole. These maps are very similar in their style, But Tolkien during the war had access to lots of maps, and we know this. We know that he was very interested in cartography, and so there are several subjects here that we can talk about, right? That they can these two can move us into the literature. We can move into cartography. We can move into the science of mapping. Um, we can look at, again, land formation. We can look at both physical and cultural geography. Like there's a million things that this can take us to. And so cross-pollination is using what we're already studying, right, to make connections between those subjects, because I don't actually think subjects should be separated, right? They all relate to each other. Um, we can also do object-based learning with primary sources. So object-based learning is when you use a particular thing in order to then expand your studies. There's an example of it in the book where I use siege engines as an example, and you can see the map that I made around taking siege engines, and then we can look at design and function. We can look at ecology and resources. We can look at architecture and how things were built to respond to um, or against these new innovations. There's all sorts of subjects that you can take and build off of that, but that starts with a primary source. Um, you can also use primary sources in your outlining. So you can, when you are outlining a particular project or research assignment, you can start adding in primary sources that relate to each thing, to be either the focus of those paragraphs or to provide supporting evidence. I also think a lot of my students like to add pictures into their assignments, and so that's a great way in order to make the assignments more visually appealing. Um, Also, unit studies and object studies. If you want to take your primary sources and build a unit study around it and have it, I would make it definitely multidisciplinary. So for example, if I were doing a unit study on Greek pottery, um, there's a lot. First of all, Greek pottery evolved over time. The different areas had different materials, different styles, the relationship between the time and place and what was depicted on the pottery, the science of mixing and providing pigment. Like there's so much you could do with just one base. And then project-based learning. So if you want to develop a project, project-based learning it's foundational um, to a question that has no yes or no answer, right? So we're asking a question that um, we have to sort of research and figure out on our own. And primary sources can often be the catalyst to figuring out what that question is that we want to answer, or provide evidence. It can also provide inspiration for a project, like if we were really interested in the terracotta warriors, in China. Um, so I've actually done a project, this is actually in the next book, where the terracotta warriors were built in sort of an assembly line fashion in a way, but they were made using molds, right? So we have these molds of multiple like torsos and arms and legs, and then the faces were personalized after they were created. And so it's a fascinating process, actually, the way in which they were made. And it would be a really wonderful project to do where you are learning how to do that yourself, right? Making the molds, creating the pieces, putting them together in different ways, and really kind of going through that process itself. But looking at the originals is how you get there. So I want to make sure that I have notes because I wanted to make sure I didn't miss anything. Um, okay, so those are all some examples of primary sources that are both in the book and not in the book. Um, I think the most challenging part of primary sources is really knowing what to do with them, right? For example, like what do you do with the Declaration of Independence, right? Other than read it. So there's a lot of things that you can do with things like that. Yes, it does provide evidence, but oftentimes students are only reading like it itself and then other people's interpretation of them. They're not really looking at what does it actually say. What why are the words important? Like each word, especially in famous documents, each word is actually quite important. When you're looking at artifacts, each the everything about that artifact is important and tells us something. It tells a story. And so when we integrate these primary sources into our history education, um, our students start building the story of history themselves, right? And they start backing off of the idea that they can't also be interpreters, they can't also be historians, which is just false, right? That's where I want them to go. I want them to start interpreting. I want them to start looking at things critically. And it only happens when you go back to the source. So that I think rounds up kind of what I wanted to say about primary sources. There's obviously a ton of information about sources in History Compass. Um, and so I'm just scanning here to make sure I didn't miss any questions. Um, yeah, reading the writing on Jefferson as you read the Declaration of Independence along with others who signed the document. That's absolutely true. Also reading classical Greek literature because that heavily influenced the way in which it was written. Also studying handwriting and calligraphy, which played a role, believe it or not, in how the document looks and feels. It was, but it and why it would have been written in that very specific way. I mean, physically written in that very specific way. There's actually quite a lot you can dive into. So that one document alone is more than what it seems. And so is every artifact. We just have to be able to go there and take some time. Now, I understand this means that you're taking more time. But I promise you that it's worth it. And if you need to be cognizant of time, then I would say at least just try for every section, every chapter, every unit, whatever, to just do one, right? Just do one object study or have one assignment that integrates primary sources so that your student gets not only experience with them, but becomes comfortable and literate in looking at primary sources. Um, you could also have some sort of project going on in addition to whatever you're doing that, you know, uses. Um, am I having more workshops on History Compass and what will the topics be? Yes, let me talk about that real quick. So next month in August, I will be doing a workshop on artifacts. So we're going to be looking at artifacts. So that's one type of primary source. This is why I wanted to do primary sources first, because now we're going to narrow in a little bit and look at artifacts themselves and do an object study together. Hopefully I will have my workshop back and I will be able to do, I'm hoping to have my dual camera so you can see what my hands are doing. But we're going to do an object study together, just like in the book. So that you can see kind of how I teach it. But if your students want to join and learn how to do it with me, I'm super happy to have them. The one after that is on maps and map making. So we're going to look at maps specifically and how to integrate those. Again, another kind of primary source. And how to integrate them into history education, but we're also going to be drawing a map together. So again, very hands-on. I do want to mention that I'm also speaking at the August C conference. I'm going to be talking about archaeology and artifacts, different than the workshop I'm having here on Facebook Live. I'm going to talk more about archaeology and its relationship to artifacts, and its relationship to historical literacy. And then if you want to follow my Facebook page in addition to Pandia Press, um, I'm co-host on this event, so you can just click on that. Um, I'm also going to be doing a workshop next month on how to use research um, to design curriculum. Like, how do you use the research that you're doing, or the research your student is doing, in order to kind of design some of your own like unit studies or add-ons to the curriculum that you might be using. So it's a busy couple of months. That's what summer's usually like. Um, and then the last question I think I wanted to answer, although if you have any more questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. I can see them. But I was sent a private question from my page that asked me last time I talked about what I meant when I said that being a historian and a research and an educator are two very distinct and specific skill sets. And I'm happy to talk on that for just a second here. So being a historian and a researcher has very specific skill sets that you need in order to create, and contribute to this historical narrative, right? We're looking at primary sources, we're looking at other secondary sources, other interpretations. We're piecing together the story of us, right? Um, Being an educator is another kind of interpretation, right? It is deciding what what we're going to teach, how to connect things, how to create the most truthful and holistic um, uh, experience of our subject, in this case, history and humanities. And I have found that it's two different skill sets. When I am writing history, I'm researching. The bulk of my time is spent researching and making sure that I've got the most accurate and timely information, with also room for my students to understand that this historical narrative is changing, and it's in part their responsibility to continue that tradition of making sure that they have the most timely information. Um, but piecing it all together, because there's so much information, right? There's so much to learn. How do I figure out, how to pull it all together so that they get a solid education, but also that it's meaningful, right? That they are finding themselves in it, that they are understanding what we know and what we don't know, that they are having a moment to pursue their own interests, that there's so much that goes into translating all of that research into something that's tangible and meaningful. And so that's what I meant by there's two different skill sets that I have to then join together, and I'm really honored to do it. So I think that's the last of the questions here. If you are watching this back and you end up having questions about primary sources or about History Compass, just go ahead and tag me. And there's a discussion post in the event. You can even do it there. And I am happy to come back in and answer them. But in the meantime, I hope that you all are enjoying History Compass, and that I will see you on the first Thursday in August for our work on object studies. So let me just check one more time. Okay. Thank you so much for joining me this morning. I really appreciate it. And I will see you next month.